Wa-Kyendo. I'm an economic policy analyst, and I've got questions in economics. So today's question is, what should or how should SWIFT and small open economies respond to the changing political economy of global payment systems? So, what is SWIFT? SWIFT is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. And what SWIFT does is every time you send money across borders, right, internationally to your bank, there's two things that happen in parallel. Number one, the money itself has to be moved, right? So some debit and crediting of accounts to say the money is moved from here to there. And the other thing that needs to happen is a message that that confirms, that sends some information about that transaction. So globally, most of these messages are handled by a firm called SWIFT. Now, SWIFT handles messages about transactions totaling up to 44 trillion, just about $44 trillion a day. So in 3 days, the equivalent of the global economy passes through SWIFT. Every 3 days, you get $100 trillion in represented by messages, right? So these messages are bearing, it's a message about some sum of money, and you put all these messages together, and they're talking about almost $100 trillion every 3 days. This firm generates revenues of 2 billion euros a year, so it's sort of a big deal. So for economists, SWIFT is a club good. It is a club good. It's a type of good. It's a category of goods. Now, it's a club good because it's non-rivalrous, because it can't be used up by a single consumer, and it is excludable because consumers must incur a cost to become members and access the network. SWIFT is not a public good. As such, it's a private good. You know, a club good is a type of private good. As such, it should not be produced by states, but should be left to the markets to establish. Now, that's an economic, it's according to economic principles. Now, the economic orthodoxy holds that a product like SWIFT is something for the private markets to build. Now, SWIFT owes its emergence to the collection of institutions built around the principles of free markets, limited governments, rule of law, and efficient regulations at the domestic level, and multilateral institutions that have driven economic and political integration in the form of projects like the European Economic Community, and then the European Union, and the World Trade Organization, that lowered barriers to free movement of peoples, factors of production, factor returns, exchange payments, and other capital and state revenue flows, and flows of goods and services across borders, right? So SWIFT benefited from markets that were built largely on these principles. Now, it is the global integration of markets and global trade that drove demand for efficient financial intermediation across borders. In response to this demand, the supply of cross-border payment settlement systems and cross-border payment messaging systems emerged. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications was a decisive response to the demand for global payment messaging systems. SWIFT was not established by governments and is not owned by governments. It is owned and governed by its members that include independent central banks, independent private institutions, and others that are in the business of financial intermediation. Now, from the European Union to Belgium, from the United States to Kenya, these financial intermediaries owe their identity to recognition by domestic authorities and are subject to regulations by these very authorities. Globally, a number of multilateral organizations and frameworks coordinate international regulation of financial intermediation in general, and then settlement and payment messaging systems in particular. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, a part of the Bank of International Settlements, together with the International Organization of Securities Commissions, the IOSCO, set global banking regulatory standards for over 95% of the world's securities markets. The Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructure, hosted under the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, sets global principles for payment system infrastructure, interoperability, and governance. Financial messaging and cross-border integration standards are handled by the ISO 20022 messaging standard, itself hosted under and coordinated by the International Organization for Standardization. The authorities are themselves limited by the aforementioned strictures of limited government, free markets, and that are themselves derived from and legitimized by classical liberal traditions. This means that the imposition of sanctions is subject to principles of objectivity and the impersonal application of the law. Sanctions with financial components have been channeled through the SWIFT network as it is an effective transmitter of policy. Studies have shown that those governments that do use SWIFT to impose sanctions and drive their policy objectives have been restricted by their own concerns over the preservation of what is admittedly an invaluable system. And they take care to abstain from disrupting the business of the firms that they do represent. That is, for example, institutions like the German state, the European Union, and the United States have backed away from actions that they perceive would result in the erosion of the value of the SWIFT network and that would disrupt pending payments for banks that hail from other countries, or rather from their countries, right? So, for example, at the onset of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Germany was concerned that cross-border payments from goods traded with Russia would be disrupted or delayed if all Russian banks were kicked out of the SWIFT system wholesale. A disturbing character of global markets today is the expedient, charged, and innuendo directed towards firms like SWIFT that are symbolic of the wealth, the prestige, and the power that wealthy societies of the Occidental enjoy. SWIFT is but one object of these allegations. Today, Russian and Chinese narratives have cast aspersions against SWIFT, right? Tomorrow, other firms could be subject to the very same attacks. A rise of economies outside the Occidental nation states is generating demand for alternative payment, messaging, and settlement systems. Advances in information communications technologies like state-based, satellite-based communications, mobile money payments, higher internet speeds, and global connectivity are also presenting new possibilities to meet the demand for global payment messaging system alternatives. States and private firms from a politically and powerful Asia may produce alternatives to SWIFT to serve payment messaging demand at bilateral and regional levels, if not global levels. Certain institutional architectures and policy postures will shape and limit the way that these products emerge. Firstly, proclamations that either assert or imply that the US dollar is purely an instrument of political domination that will be replaced by any number of alternative configurations from a BRICS gold-based currency to a yuan-based payment system are both unsound. They're examples of like unsound, highly motivated, expedient proposals. For one, the strength of the US dollar is based primarily on the trust the global markets have in the classical liberal institutions of the United States, and the fact that the United States is an important global importer that flushes out US dollar flows into the world in a way that the European Union and China do not. US imports are paid for by the sales of US state securities that the world trusts would be paid off eventually. Important consumers. Now, consumers of US securities are willing to hold them for as long as 100 years. China itself is an important consumer of US, of American securities. Furthermore, the independence of the Federal Reserve adds an additional buttress, right, to this trust in that consumers of the US dollar and US securities trust that the dollar and the interest payments paid by their holdings will not deteriorate in value in line with narrow political expediencies. The Chinese yuan is a managed currency designed to drive Chinese exports to the world. The institutional architecture of China does not facilitate the circulation of the yuan or generate the trust required to render yuan holdings and conversely valuable, right? To render them valuable, and conversely, yuan denominated payments to be as restrictive as those denominated in the US dollar or the euro for that matter. More fundamentally, the SWIFT is currency agnostic. All currencies can be transacted by the SWIFT. Furthermore, political statements that cast aspersions on the SWIFT and the US dollar in the same breath are disinformative. The two are not synonyms. The two are not purely instruments of American or Occidental intent, but are largely market-driven institutions. This means that states presiding over small, open economies should not propose the creation of alternatives by the states themselves. Furthermore, civil society and citizens should be alert to the fact that these proposals can only serve elites, political elites, and economic elites who intend to destroy value by engaging the state in the creation of private goods in the form of payment messaging systems to further their aims. These elites circumvent sanctions and continue to effect payments outside of the SWIFT system. When they originate in the Occidental, sanctions on financial payment systems, financial payment messaging systems, are channeled through SWIFT, politically motivated, but are based on legal considerations governing the breach of laws that can be challenged in courts and that are subject to executive meddling. This means that civil society and the public in small open economies should be alert to the exact meaning of proposals to build alternatives to SWIFT using public funds. Furthermore, the idea that authoritarian, opaque regimes whose government functions are not independent and are without checks and balances, such that legislation and the interpretation of laws is subject to and whose policy posture bends to the whims of minorities. So the legislation and interpretation of laws is subject to the prevailing executive wish and to the particular capacities, caprices rather, of well-connected public officials and private actors. It is more probable that determined autocrats waste public resources and drive a proliferation of payment messaging systems, all in order to counter possible or real impositions by their fellow autocrats. Societies and small open economies should interrogate the idea that autocratic elites are necessarily kinder to each other, and that by extension, this autocratic brotherhood that